Curse City has been sitting on my shelf for quite some time now. I managed to get my hands on a box after it went out of production, so as you can imagine, I got pretty happy at the time. Built all the models, then started painting it. I painted the zombies and the skeletons after I watched a couple of really cool YouTube videos. And well, then I just stalled. Even though I really wanted to play the game and paint all the other models, I started to do other things, and it has been just gathering dust since then, even though me and my wife really wanted to play it, and unfortunately it didn't just miraculously finish itself. But Curse City is back in production again, so this is the time for me to jump right back in and use this as an opportunity and an excuse to start painting the models again. But I already set a certain standards with the zombies and the skeletons, right? They are painted to this certain standard, which is not exactly super high, but they look relatively nice, and I completed them fast. So that's what I wanted to do with the rest of the models as well. And this time I want to focus mostly on the heroes, the 8 heroes, and finish all of them in just a couple of afternoons really. And the method I'm going to use for these, we can just call 3+2 contrast. Contrast because we are going to mainly use contrast paints, and 3+2 because there are 3 essential steps and 2 optional steps, and it's up to you if you stop after the third step or you actually complete the last 2 as well, depending on how good you actually want the models to look in the end and how much time you are willing to put into it. My painting method is going to be challenged here a little bit because I'm painting completely unique hero models. They are not part of a squad, so they don't really share color schemes. But there are a couple of interesting ways that I can still manage to keep my timetable here and paint them relatively fast, and you will see how I did that. So let's just get on with it and let's slap some paint on these models. Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you are watching Phalanx Miniatures. Since I'm evil, let's start with step 0, which is basing the models. Usually I'm super lazy or hasty, depending on how you look at it when it comes to this. I end up just painting the models and come up with the bases after they are done. This time though, I wanted to do it right. I didn't have any fancy city bases at hand and I didn't feel like printing something, so I decided to give Milliput a go. Full disclosure, this is the first time I have tried creating some broken old city streets like this. You guys can tell me in the comments if you like them, but I was pretty satisfied with the results and I learned some valuable lessons about working with Milliput along the way, so win-win. Since we'll be using contrast paints over our primer, it is extremely important to have a bright primer underneath. But if we prime the whole model simply white or light grey as GW advises with the contrast paints, funnily enough, what we will do is we will lose a lot of the contrast that we can have with the Zenithal. I used an airbrush to achieve this first by spraying the dark color everywhere and then spraying from above with the white. You can use 2 replicants to achieve the same effect as well if you don't have an airbrush. You might also notice that instead of black, I used the dark violet for my shadow color. This is completely optional. I felt fancy and I thought that the violet would go well with the ambience of the city and tie the models together. Plus, it is a more interesting shadow color than black. Feel free to use black though if you are more comfortable with that. This step is quite self-explanatory, just slap on the contrast paints. I decided to mostly go with the color schemes suggested in the art for Curse City, partly because I quite like them and partly because I wanted to be relatively fast and I didn't want to spend time figuring out something new, which might mean that later on I have to redo some parts if I didn't like them. I took some creative liberties here and there though. 2 important things to pay attention to. 1, try not to get the paint on things that are not supposed to be that color. If you do it, it will be difficult to paint over it with another contrast. If it happens, wipe the mistake away quickly with a wet brush before it has the chance to dry. 2, be generous with the amount of paint you apply to achieve a nice coverage, but if you see a lot of pooling somewhere, go back with an offloaded brush and soak it up a bit. Contrast will be patchy no matter what we do, but we can try to minimize it a bit. Notice that while each of the models have some unique colors, I'm trying to use the same base colors for similar parts, especially all the browns and blacks. This makes the process easier and also helps to keep the look of the models more coherent. This is still step 2. We are still applying the base colors, but since there are no metallic contrast paints, we just make do with normal ones. I advise to do this step after you are done with the contrast paints, since it is very easy to contaminate everything with metallic pigments if you do it together. Here is another optional step. Despite what comes next, I still apply some washes on the metals. I do this since we want to go for a nice dark feel and I want to have as much contrast as possible. This is the secret sauce. This is what really makes this paint job look dark and contrasty in the end. An oil wash. Well, hear me out. I know that oil paints for mini painting look scary and you feel comfortable with your acrylics, but we will only use 2 of them, black and brown, and it will be super easy. Once you have tried this, you will want to keep using it since it's just, well, pure magic. All you need is some regular black and brown oil paints and some white spirits. You can pick these up super cheap in any art supply store. You mix the 2 colors, a bit more black than brown is ideal, and then add enough white spirit to make the consistency similar to milk or a tiny bit thicker. Then you take a big brush and you simply slap it on without any hesitation. If you did it right, the mix just flows into all the crevices all by itself. As I said, it's pure magic. If you want the end results to be more on the grimdark side, you can simply let it dry like this, or you can do it like me and use a piece of sponge or something similar to wipe most of the stuff that is not in the crevices away. Oil paints take some time to dry, so best leave it for a night before starting to work on it again. Why we did this, you ask? Well, because despite the name, contrast paints don't really create too much contrast, and overall the models tend to be quite two-dimensional if you just use them normally. Combine them with a Zenithal highlight and an oil wash though, and the end result is much better, as you can probably see here. This one is as simple as it gets. I applied a quick coat of matte varnish. The glossy finish of contrast paints is one of the downsides in my opinion. The glossy surface they create looks shiny in all the wrong ways and looks quite unnatural. Applying a matte varnish fixes this issue real quick though, and it also adds some protection for our paint job. I use an airbrush, but you can use a can or simply paint it on as well. If you use a brush, you can also exclude the metal bits, but I didn't bother since I will be fixing that in the next stage. If you are skipping the next step, it is worth selectively using the matte varnish though and not hitting the metals. Try this and be amazed how much better your models will look without the pesky shine. This one is entirely up to you. You can make it as easy or as complex as you want it to be, or you can skip it entirely. You can add edge highlights, paint in all the small details, add different effects, whatever your heart desires and your time allows. Less can be more in this case though, since we want to go for something relatively quick. I decided to go with a lot of edge highlights and pretty stark ones too, to create a lot of contrast. The more highlights you go for at this stage, the more readable the model becomes, since the highlights together with the shadows we created with the oil wash and the Zenithal combo will nicely separate parts of the model. Here's a useful trick. If you want to cut corners, you can use a universal highlight color. In my case, I used beige from Vallejo for 80% of the highlights of the model. This has the added advantage of tying the models together, but it also helps me avoid using a million different highlight colors. And here's the final results. They won't win any golden demons, but they didn't take ages to complete and they look much better than what contrast paints alone could have accomplished. I would argue that after the third step they already look better than that, to be honest. Now I have to just paint all the rest of the bad guys and me and my wife won't have any excuses not to play Curse City anymore. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and learned something useful. Remember to give it a like if you did, and please subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. See you in the next one.